Hi everyone. So the first video here in our Principles of Training series is talking about adaptation and your body's response to a given training stimulus. So this adaptation principle governs exactly what your body's response to any given training stimulus should be. So the guy who, I suppose, the forefather of adaptation syndrome theory is a man by the name of Hans Selye. He's a Canadian physiologist. In the 50s, he came up with his general adaptation syndrome theory, otherwise known as the GAS or GAS principle. So what it states is that training will induce a stress response, and it also coincides with acute cellular damage. So when we say acute, it's immediate cellular damage and inflammation in the cell, as well as metabolic fatigue and that corresponding reduction in performance. So you'll notice straight away after a training session, man, I'm beat. I couldn't do that again if you asked me. We see that quite often when even when we talk about recreational fitness, and we might have, let's say, a 3-minute AMRAP followed by a 2-minute rest and a 3-minute AMRAP. If they were the same workout, you would more than likely see reduced performance, more than likely. And that's down to that adaptation and stress response. So the time, everything requires time to repair and recover and to restore baseline function. So as this happens, and the stress, the system that's stressed is adapting and it's becoming more resilient to that stress that you've put in there. So like I've mentioned before, when we talk about stress being a bucket, you've got hundreds of different buckets for the different stress responses that you have in your system, depending on what system we're talking about. We'll talk about cardiovascular system in a while as a simple example. So when recovery is complete, the system may undergo what's known as a supercompensation effect. And this, in theory, is the ideal time to repeat that training dose and to repeat that training unit. However, more practically, athletes training more frequently will undergo after effects that result in complex interactions between fitness and fatigue. So think of it this way: fitness is quite a slow product. It takes time to develop, whereas fatigue is a very rapid process. We can see this in a workout setting. If you were asked to sprint at your fastest, how long could you do that for? Fatigue catches up with you pretty quickly in that type of modality. It even catches up with the world's best. So if we take Usain Bolt and his sprint performance, for example, fatigue was starting to catch him, and he's actually just better at not slowing down more than the guys around him. He's not actually, continuing to accelerate. He's just getting better at not slowing down more. So that's his fatigue response and his management of that. So two guys by the name of Zatiorsky and Kramer in 2006 noted that when you're training energy systems, or you're training systems of the body in general, anything more than two systems, and we start to get this hugely competing effect, and you actually see a negative effect in the training response and the adaptation response. So the study carried out by those guys in 2006 stated that 3 is one too many systems to be working on in any one small micro unit in any one training session. So what you would have is a compromise of what gains you could potentially make if we compete and try to train too many things at once. That's of particular importance to mixed modal athletes. So let's say CrossFit athletes, for example, trying to do everything at once rather than taking their time and looking at what energy system am I trying to develop, what one's recovering currently, and where am I looking for those supercompensation windows in my performance. So we'll discuss that later in a periodization video that we're going to do. But you can train a number of systems simultaneously with positive effects, of course, but it has to be planned and ordered extremely well. It's a little bit simpler for a field athlete. The demands are obviously competing as well. We want to have strength, power, endurance, reaction skills included in that they'd actually be one of the first things you'd have in there. If we're talking about someone like a CrossFit athlete, more often than not, we end up overcooking athletes and we don't actually get the correct intended stimulus of what we're training for. So we want to look at that in closer, I suppose, we'll look at that closer in a further video when we talk about periodization. And then we'll do that in another video anyway. So adaptation overall is just the process of adjusting to the physical, environmental, or psychological environment and stress and stimulus that we find ourselves in. So it's a well-established fact that the body will respond to a given stress or stimulus. Like I mentioned earlier, Hans Selye in the 50s came up with his general adaptation syndrome, which described that theoretical model of training and fatigue and then recovery and, coming back in a super compensated fashion. So coming back better than what you previously were, essentially. The theory, it's been around for decades and decades, and it's still one of two main theories that we use to discuss adaptation in a sports performance setting. So what we see with it, and it's easiest to graph this, if we've got performance here, let's just talk about whatever the performance marker is. We won't complicate things too much, and we'll put time here. So what we see is a training stimulus. So let's say that's our stress, and we'll talk about cardiovascular fitness because it's simplest. It's the most prevalent modality. So here's our training block. Immediately afterwards, we see a reduction in performance. So you'll see you're tired, you're fatigued. So you couldn't be expected to go out and do a 5K run at your fastest now and then come back and do that again. So what we see is fatigue. With adequate rest and recovery, we come back. Here's our baseline. We actually come back fitter than what we previously were. Now again, I'm simplifying this. This is one energy system. If you're to think about how we handle training in more complex environments, let's say a Gaelic footballer, for example, we're not just talking about the cardiovascular system. We're looking at their endurance. We're looking at their power production. We're looking at their skills. All these things need to be put into a periodized model where we can actually have adequate rest recovery, and these competing systems aren't falling on top of each other, where we're really just flogging the athletes with just more work for the sake of more work. So what we've got here is a performance improvement, essentially, once we've recovered enough, and that's known as supercompensation. So if we assume that this is the shock delivered, this is fatigue, this is recovery, and then we come back here super compensated. So better, fitter, whatever it is, whatever you want to call it. Let's say if we're talking about cardiovascular response, then yes, we're looking at the heart, the lungs, their ability to transport and offload oxygen and carbon dioxide, the cell itself producing ATP, or energy and supplying fuel stores, supplying glycogen to the cell, really down to like microscopic levels where we've got capillaries within the muscle fiber. All these competing systems, they're all fatiguing, but they all recover and come back stronger. So those capillaries could be denser in the muscle fiber, more muscle fibers being provided with more blood, more oxygenated blood, the whole cardiovascular system being far more robust and able to withstand further stimulus. Now, what we see is that fatigue occurring, but after that fatigue, we get to a stage where we start to adapt, and if we give it the right conditions. So we're here, and sleep, hydration, nutrition, lower stress levels, we start to see recovery, and we get back up to that super compensated point in time and in performance. So it will take time before it returns to baseline, and that's really what we're mostly concerned with when we talk about the effects of training and the post-training period, and how it's been effective with the baseline level, and how we've gotten back up to a higher level, how we get fitter, how we get stronger, how we get faster. So that super compensated level is all important. So what we've got when we get to here is essentially the athlete can return to training better than they previously were. Now, one thing you would say when you get to this point is you can use it or lose it. Now, you don't lose it entirely and you don't lose it straight away. But let's say we did a training bout, we recover, we come back. To get better again, we need to repeat a training bout. And we'll talk about overload in a further video. But you've got to go again. Sorry, that's all wrong. You got to go again, fatigue yourself, recover, come back stronger again. So again, you're above your old level. So you're getting better all the time. You're at a new supercompensation. So that's just cardiovascular level, and we see greater positive adaptation across time with a good balance of rest and recovery and a correct dosage of work. So if we don't receive that second stimulus within that supercompensation window, and it depends on the system, but let's say cardiovascular, that window is larger than other systems, you'll just return to baseline. So let's say we don't train here. What happens is eventually over time you'll just return to baseline and you'll just flatline here where you previously were. You don't get any fitter. Now that's a fairly complex thing as well, but you got to use it or lose it. So the theory would guide a strength and conditioning practitioner as follows. So stress occurs in the system that's taxed. It doesn't occur in any other systems unless you got to understand what the competing demands of what you're training for are. It takes time for the system to recover. So if we were doing repeated sprints on a Monday, we wouldn't go out and do repeated sprints on a Tuesday. If I was doing Olympic lifting on a Monday, I wouldn't exactly go out and do Olympic lifting again on a Tuesday. So if repeated training stressing the same system is to be done during this recovery phase, then the recovery or baseline will be compromised if we don't give it adequate rest and recovery. So if we do it here, we'll end up pushing ourselves further down and end up in a hyper fatigued state, and we never really improve. We're just lashing more work on top of more work. If the athlete trains a different system while the other one is recovering, then we may compromise the recovery of that system. So we're talking about that cardiovascular system, and we add in some sort of different, let's say we add in a bit of strength training there on our recovery day from this. It may hinder my recovery from that cardiovascular bout. Now, a good strength and conditioning practitioner will understand the competing demands and that you can train a good amount, and we are robust animals and that we can handle a decent amount of stress. But you've got to be able to play them off each other and understand what responses get the correct, overall stimulus that we're looking for. So what we'd have, for example, when we look at this in practice, we'd have, let's say we have 4 training sessions, and I'll get rid of these colored lines. And this is how we would microdose to an athlete, for example. So you'd have training session 1, and we're at baseline. Training session 2, we're a little bit worse. Training session 3. Now I could go on, I could go 4, 5, 6, 7, and I'm just going to keep getting worse. There might be, you can't work 24 hours. There will be small windows of rest and recovery. But let's say we're talking about the cardiovascular system. I tax it day 1, day 2, day 3. I don't want to keep hammering on that door. What we're going to do is rest and recover. And then we're in that supercompensation window where we want to adapt and we want to get better. So that recovery period between 3 and 4 is absolutely vital. And just hammering on the same thing over and over again is where you're going to run into trouble. So it's all exercise and sport dependent. So recent studies have shown that muscle damage markers continue to be raised above baseline for several days. So again, like I said, you don't want to just keep doing the same thing over and over again. You need to have this planned. It can't be chaotic in nature. You have to have this planned. So like I mentioned, if that's your aerobic or your cardiovascular system, and we want to work on some strength demands at the same time, the recovery curve for that potentially and where you're at in your training life cycle could be a hell of a lot sharper. You might fatigue way quicker from that work. You might recover a lot quicker, but you've got to be able to manage it. If we put too high a stress into that strength piece, we might end up pushing that other energy system way too far out and the recovery to be too far out. So we have to look at those damage markers and make sure that we understand what our baseline is and what we want to achieve with our training. The important point here is that physical and functional demands of any training activity or given sport will stress the muscle and at a cellular level, and the inflammatory responses differ depending on the training type. If we have high intensity workouts, we see a higher concentration of inflammation responses in the muscle fiber. So we want to make sure that we're dosing that correctly and we're not just doing high intensity work all day, every day, 5 days a week, because that's going to end up with hyper fatigue, lots of inflammation, too much damage in the muscle fiber, and not enough recovery. So we'd be better prepared to plan loading and application of training when we understand what it is we're trying to achieve and when we understand this adaptation theory. So again, it must be noted that adaptation is specific to the imposed stimulus. So yes, I'm out running my 5 kilometer time trial for that cardiovascular system, but it's not improving my deadlift. You could argue there might be some very small overlap in some training modalities, but to keep it simple, I'm out running my 5k time, I'm not getting better at my deadlift. But if I do my deadlift before I do my 5k time trial, I've pre-fatigued myself neurologically and muscularly in, far too high a concentration potentially to go out and get a decent stimulus off my cardiovascular work. So the process of adaptation is specific to that stress imposed. Training my 5k time isn't going to improve my deadlift more than likely. So there's a lot of studies done on this. Zatiorski, Kramer, Fleck and Kramer, Theodore Bompa did one. I can add links if anyone is interested. I'll add links to the comments below to all those studies. But basically, specific energy producing organelles in the muscle fiber, let's say the mitochondria in your muscle fiber, they'll improve in function and they'll increase in number as a result of endurance training. But if we looked at the same adaptation for strength training, it doesn't occur. So you don't see that improvement and increased number of mitochondria when we do that deadlift session, for example. So like maximal strength training will affect a greater increase in the cross-sectional area of a muscle, to facilitate the growth in actin and myosin, cross-bridge structures, and muscle fibers in general. But that muscle fiber growth does not display higher mitochondria. So that mitochondria is the guy that allows you to use oxygen essentially in the muscle, and let's just say it's the endurance part of a muscle that allows you to continue to go. Doing your deadlift isn't going to improve that. You can make the muscle bigger, but just because it's bigger doesn't mean it's going to be filled with more mitochondria. So we will, talk about those types of principles, and there's another one, specificity, that we're going to talk about in a further video. But until that time, I want you just to focus on that in particular, that the stimulus and the adaptation is specific to the demands that we ask of the body. Regardless of the system trained, changes do occur immediately. So adaptation happens like that in a flash. It can be very, very obvious in structure, very, very quickly. So if we were to do a muscle biopsy and take a piece of muscle straight out, we'd notice changes immediately in the structure, in the chemical reactions in that muscle. So how many systems can be drained? And this is absolutely key, particularly for CrossFit athletes or mixed modal athletes, as we call them. If several systems are being stressed and trained simultaneously, then the adaptation system will be compromised entirely. There's too many systems competing. So it's not a good idea to have 2 or more. And we spoke about that earlier. One last little bit, we spoke about that fitness fatigue theory. So that's essentially this: when you've got to induce some fatigue into the system and then get a response by recovering adequately. So that's absolutely vitally important. to any training type. The last thing I suppose to talk about in adaptations is the dose of training. So the practical implications following this model of adaptation is that training results in a complex interaction between fatigue, so the repair and restoration and recovery, and adaptation. So training the same system or component in sequence will result in just accumulated fatigue, similar to the supercompensation model, and then we see this reduced positive performance over time. That will happen if we don't rid ourselves of all those negative trace elements of damage in the muscle cells, so that inflammation and micro damage in the muscle fibers. So that's pretty much your adaptation. To kind of summarize, and we must recognize this, fatigue occurs as a result of training. It's a byproduct of training, and it's totally natural. There is a time course of recovery required before the body or system adapts positively. You don't get that positive adaptation immediately. There is a window of opportunity for the next training session that has to tax that specific system, which should occur when fatigue is significantly reduced or almost entirely eliminated. But again, we won't get the positive adaptations if we don't give it adequate rest and recovery. The fourth point, training is, it's a logical process. It's not a chaotic process. So that's absolutely vital that we know that. Training of another energy system or another system of the body can occur while a previously trained system is recovering. However, if we look at studies done, it does allow for greater complexity. And if you're doing that, you really, really should understand what the competing demands of your training system are and what your fitness and fatigue responses are to training. So guys, that's adaptation. 22 minutes in total. Pretty long rundown of it. But what we're trying to get to is you need rest, you need recovery, and you need to understand that if you're training multiple energy systems and multiple systems of the body, that training has really got to be ordered so keenly. It can't be chaotic. Okay. Feel free to leave a comment below. If you've stuck with me for the last 22 minutes, definitely leave a comment and let me know what you thought. Thanks, guys.